Mike had suggested, actually, Don had suggested that the moderator's job should be as Puritan as possible. There has always been a soft spot in my heart for the Cavaliers, but nonetheless, I will try to be puritanical and leave it to Lord Rochester or someone too. So the next session, we're delighted to have John Harrison from the University of Virginia, a firm and elegant Cavalier, and equally elegantly Stephen Vodek from American.
We're just the Eagles.
Take it away.
Thank you, Myman. First, I do want to say hello to Mike Ramsey, participating via speakerphone, because although this is the first of these Originalism conferences that I have physically attended, it is the second of which I participated in, since last year I was participating as Mike Ramsey is through SpeakerLink, having been snowed in Charlottesville. And I hope no one who was there listening to me last year will be scandalized by what I'm about to say, which is in true internet fashion, I was in fact sitting in my kitchen in my pajamas. At this point, I put on a tie while I was watching the snow come down last year. So, Mike, I'm not going to ask what's going on there in Australia. I have a couple of introductory thoughts, and this may be a little rough because I decided to change a little bit what I was going to say by way of introduction as a result of something Don Dripps said at the last panel, because the main thing I want to focus on as what I think is at stake with respect to the habeas corpus suspension clause is whether it is primarily about the right or the remedy. The traditional view for about the last 100 years at least, strongly influenced by Dicey, is that to suspend the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus is to take away the judicial remedy without, and this is an important part of it, without affecting the substance of the right of natural liberty. According to Dicey, legislation that actually substantively authorized detention took the form of indemnification legislation subsequent to a suspension, but that all the suspension did was do something fundamentally structural by changing the remedy and change the responsible branch of government from the courts to the executive branch. And I will confess, as an alumnus of the Office of Legal Counsel, that seemed to me a perfectly natural and in some ways quite compelling understanding, thinking that structural questions about whether the executive or the judiciary that makes a decision are very important. Clearly, that's something that also influences Trevor Morrison's work on this area. Nevertheless, a couple of years ago, I was reading an early draft of part of what became Paul Halliday's book about habeas corpus, and was shaken out of my Dicey slumber, and was astonished and intrigued to learn that classic suspensions of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus in the 18th century generally said nothing about the writ of habeas corpus, did not purport to affect the judicial remedy other than to say no bail or main prize, but did not say that the person who was being detained could not seek habeas corpus, but rather in effect meant you can get all the habeas corpus you want, but the courts won't let you out now because the substantive power of the executive branch to detain has been expanded. That is to say, habeas corpus suspension legislation in the 18th century and in the 17th century was fundamentally about the right and not about the remedy. Now, having put it that way and focusing on it, as I say, in part because of what Don Dripps said, I do want briefly to justify talking about the right and remedy separately and talking, as I now do, right first, and saying the suspension clause is about the right, justify that against possible claims of anachronism by making 2 points. First, classic formulation of the idea that for every right there is a remedy. That is to say, the first question is, does the plaintiff have a right? And the second question is there a legal doctrine that tells us what the remedy is? Let us look to the separate body of law to find that, is, of course, Marbury against Madison. That's the mode of reasoning in Marbury against Madison. First, Marbury has a right to his commission. Second, there is a remedy. The appropriate remedy is habeas corpus. The other thing, historically, I'll say by way of justifying the separating the two and doing it rights first, is equity. The large idea of equity was it was a separate body of remedies that protected the same rights that the courts of common law did. And so one of the maxims of equity is, and was, equity follows the law. That is to say, equity looks to the law to determine what are legally protected interests, what are people's rights, and then in many situations provides a more perfect remedy for them. So although it's certainly true that the writ system tended to cause people often, Don's absolutely right about this, tended to cause people to think remedy first and right second, there was also a fully valid way of thinking that went the other way around, right first, remedy second. And that, I think, is a large part of what goes into understanding the habeas corpus suspension clause. So that's point number one. One thing I will say substantively about the argument that a number of us are now developing, me included, Amanda Tyler, Paul Halliday, David Shapiro, one thing about the particular version of it that I'm urging in this paper that I think is a virtue, the one that first says habeas corpus suspensions are expansions of the executive power to detain people and hence are about the right of natural liberty, because the right of natural liberty is constricted when the executive branch's power to detain is increased. One virtue, I think, of the particular understanding of suspension that I'm urging here is that it does not create a problem for some forms of non-criminal detention that we've become quite familiar with, for example, civil commitment. There are some other substantive theories of the suspension clause that can have a hard time understanding why, or maybe wondering whether, civil commitment is permissible. My answer, of course, is civil commitment does not provide for detention at the discretion of the executive, and that the sign of a suspension of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus in the 17th and 18th centuries was precisely the grant of extremely broad discretion to the executive to detain. So it wasn't just an expansion of that power. It wasn't just the authorization to hold prisoners of war. It wasn't just the authorization to hold enemy aliens. It was the creation of discretion. That's the sort of my large contribution to this. The other thing, that's a substantive point. The other thing I want to say is methodological and ask, do you have to be an originalist to agree with me? And I think maybe yes, but if so, only in a quite limited sense, in which I think a great many people who wouldn't otherwise characterize themselves as originalists are originalists. Because, of course, what I'm saying and what anybody who takes, what anybody who talks about the suspension clause has to understand is there are terms of art in there. Habeas corpus is a term of art. What I'm saying is actually the term of art is larger. It's not just habeas corpus, it's suspension of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus. And that has my historical claim is, and Amanda Tyler's historical claim, is that has a slightly counterintuitive content because, in fact, it's not about the writ of habeas corpus, the remedy at all. It's a larger concept pointing to those statutes that were called suspensions of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus that dramatically expanded the discretion to detain of the executive. And I think any time you say a provision in a constitution or a law is a term of art, that means you then have to look at the place and the time, both the body of technical users and the time during which the term of art was alive, to understand what the term of art means. And if, as is now, because of historical developments, people don't use the term of art anymore, well, you can't look to contemporary users of the term of art of suspension of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, because other than a handful of us, and I hope a growing group, there aren't that many. So naturally, where are you going to look for the live version of the term of art? Well, in this case, you have to look to the past. But I don't think that takes any really strong originalist commitments. It just takes a willingness to understand sometimes the use of terms of art in legal documents, and then to say, well, to understand terms of art, of course, there are people whose usages you have to understand. Sometimes those people are going to be located overwhelmingly in the past, again, because the term of art isn't in use so much anymore. But I don't think that requires any really strong form of originalism. If you think that originalism, as I do, is fundamentally about the time axis, is fundamentally about at what point in time do you understand text or intention or whatever it is you think is appropriate. So I think there's a little originalism in saying that this is what the Constitution means, but I think enough so that most people, again, including a whole lot who generally would not regard themselves as originalist, would, if they agree with the substantive claim, this is how the concept was used by technical users in the 17th and 18th century, would find it persuasive. Thanks, and I want to hear what Steve has to say.